Imagine this. You are in the heart of the Roman Empire, a place full of grandeur and power. The marble columns shine under the sun, but behind that glorious facade, Rome hides a terrifying darkness. An empire that reached the stars in power and culture, but had no hesitation in taking suffering to the extreme to maintain its dominion. Have you ever wondered how far human brutality can go when trying to impose order? Today, in this video, I'm going to take you on a journey to discover the 10 most brutal and terrifying punishments that Rome applied to its prisoners, traitors, and enemies. Punishments so cruel, so merciless, that even now, after millennia, they still chill the blood of anyone who hears about them. I assure you that some of these penalties are so shocking that you'll find it hard to believe they actually happened. But before we begin, I want you to leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think the Romans crossed the line by applying these tortures? Or do you think they were necessary to maintain the empire's supremacy? Let me know what you think as we move forward in this grim story, Death at the Tarpeian Rock. Let's start with one of the most humiliating and public, death at the Tarpeian Rock. This punishment was applied to those who committed treason against Rome, from the greatest traitors to lesser criminals. The Tarpeian Rock was a cliff on the Capitoline Hill, and from there the condemned were thrown into the void, falling from a height of 25 meters. The impact was not only physical, but also a public act of humiliation, a warning to the Roman people about what happened to those who betrayed their loyalty. What is shocking about this penalty is not only the physical punishment, but the symbolic aspect. The Tarpeian Rock became a place of eternal shame. In Roman history, treason was not just to be punished, it had to be erased from the city's memory. And the worst part, treason was punished in such a public way that even the most powerful Romans couldn't escape it, as seen in the case of Simon Bar Giora, who suffered this fate. Giant swings and lions. Let's move on to one of the most sadistic and macabre tortures, giant swings and lions. This form of execution was used on prisoners of war, especially those captured in battles. The prisoners were tied to a gigantic swing known as the petorua, and while one of the prisoners was lifted to great heights, their companion on the other end fell abruptly to the ground, where a group of wild lions awaited. The hungry animals immediately attacked the fallen prisoner, tearing them apart slowly before the eyes of thousands of Romans. This torture spectacle was witnessed by large crowds that gathered in the amphitheaters to watch how a man's life slowly faded away while the masses cheered. This form of punishment not only served to end the lives of the prisoners, but also served as entertainment for the Roman people, a terrifying display of the pleasure the Romans found in the suffering of others. The leather bag, another torture that defies imagination. The leather bag. This punishment was reserved for those who committed the worst of crimes, parricide, the murder of a father or mother. But the way Rome applied the penalty was even more brutal. The condemned were placed inside a leather bag, along with a variety of wild animals, dogs, snakes, monkeys, and roosters. The condemned was then thrown into a river, and while the water filled their lungs, the animals attacked, causing indescribable suffering. This method of execution, known as poena clay, was not just a death sentence, but a public spectacle of horror. Initially, this punishment was a rare option, but during the Roman Empire, it became increasingly common. Even Emperor Hadrian used it as a form of execution for those who had committed crimes so atrocious that Rome could not allow them to continue living. Decimation. Decimation was the worst nightmare for any Roman soldier. If a unit of the army showed cowardice, disobeyed orders, or fled in the midst of battle, this terrible punishment was applied. 1 in every 10 soldiers had to be executed. The comrades of these selected soldiers, those who survived the selection, were required to kill them, usually by beating them with sticks. The purpose of decimation was to restore discipline in the troops, but the cruelty of the practice was such that, instead of strengthening military spirit, it provoked deep mistrust among the soldiers. The army's morale was destroyed, and the legions were terrified by the possibility of being chosen to die at the hands of their own comrades. This brutality was applied in various battles and confrontations during the Republic and the Roman Empire. becoming one of the most feared tactics within the armed forces. The fustuarium. Within the Roman army, there was an even more cruel punishment, the fustuarium. This punishment was applied to legionaries who committed serious offenses such as desertion or sleeping during the guard shift. The process was simple, but devastating. The condemned was beaten to death by their own fellow legionnaires. The fustuarium was not just an execution, but a form of collective humiliation. The soldiers' own comrades would carry out the punishment. First, a military tribune would mark the sentence, and then the other soldiers would carry out the order. This brutal punishment aimed to make a public demonstration of the harshness of Roman military discipline, but in many cases, it only caused resentment and division among the soldiers, weakening the cohesion of the legion. Strangulation in the Mamertine prison. The Mamertine prison was one of the most feared places in Rome. Originally built as a cistern, this prison was transformed into a center for imprisoning the most important prisoners, and especially the defeated, leaders and political enemies of Rome. This place, surrounded by darkness and despair, became synonymous with eternal suffering for those who fell into its dungeons. The most feared punishment within the walls of the Mamertine was not hunger or physical torture, but strangulation. The method was simple but effective. Prisoners, especially those of high status, such as foreign leaders or political figures, were strangled as a form of execution. This death, besides being brutal, was also a public act of humiliation. For centuries, figures such as Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, a conspirator of the Second Catilinarian conspiracy, were executed in this place, their bodies sealed in the oblivion of Rome's dungeons. The Mamertine was not just a prison, but a clear message of what would happen to those who dared to challenge the power of the Roman Empire. Its history is a reminder of the constant fear that reigned in Rome, and how political figures were not only victims of executions, but of symbolic humiliations that lasted beyond their death. Death by bee stings. One of the cruelest and lesser-known punishments of Rome was death by bee stings. This method was reserved for deserters or traitors. The victim was tied up and placed in a basket, which was then suspended near a swarm of enraged bees. The torturers provoked the attack of the bees, which would sting the victim repeatedly, leading to endless suffering. What was most terrifying about this punishment was not only the agony caused by the stings, but how slow the death was. The victim could die from anaphylactic shock, exhaustion due to the number of stings, or infection from the wounds. The bees became such a lethal torture tool that the pain they caused seemed like a mixture of wild nature and human cruelty. It was not only a physical punishment, but also a horror spectacle, witnessed by Romans who came to see how the victim suffered under nature's claws. Death by boiling. One of the most inhuman punishments in Rome was death by boiling. This practice was mainly applied to high-ranking criminals or enemies of the empire, such as coin forgers. The condemned were immersed in boiling liquids, such as water, oil, or tar. But the most terrifying part of this punishment was how slow the death was. The victim would start to be submerged in the boiling liquid, and the pain from the burns was so intense that the agony could last for hours before the person died. This punishment served not only to eliminate enemies of Rome, but also to publicly demonstrate the severity of the empire. During Nero's reign, this method of execution was used many times, especially against Christians whom Nero blamed for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. This practice not only served as an example, but also showed all Romans the absolute power that Rome had over life and death. Crucifixion. Crucifixion was probably the most well-known punishment in ancient Rome, but its brutality is often underestimated. This punishment was reserved for slaves, low-ranking criminals, pirates, and especially for those who posed a threat to the empire, such as rebels and Christians. The victim was scourged, wounded, and then crucified on a wooden cross, making death slow and painful. The punishment was not only a physical death, but also a public humiliation. The Romans wanted everyone to fear crucifixion. The victim suffered for hours, often days, struggling to breathe as suffocation and pain took over their body. Worst of all, the condemned was left on display in a public area, so others could see the fate that awaited them if they opposed Rome. This extreme form of punishment also became a symbol of Roman oppression, used not only to eliminate the state's enemies but to dehumanize them in the most humiliating way possible. Crucifixion became a lesson that resonated throughout the empire, showing the absolute inequality between Romans and their enemies. Being buried alive. And finally, we come to one of the most inhuman punishments, being buried alive. Although more common in the Eastern Roman Empire, there are also records of this practice in Rome. The punishment was intended for those who violated sacred vows, such as the Vestal Virgins, who were required to maintain their chastity. If one of them broke her vow, the punishment was severe. She would be buried alive in a secluded place, a sealed tomb, where she would die slowly, deprived of air and food. This punishment was not only about eliminating the body, but also destroying the person's reputation. The ritual of burying a Vestal Virgin who violated her vow had a tremendous symbolic weight, as violating the chastity vows of a Vestal was seen as a direct threat to the religious balance and security of Rome. The death of these women became a public warning that even those closest to the gods were not exempt from the laws of Rome. Now that we've explored these horrific punishments, I want to know your opinion. Which of these methods do you find the most cruel and why? How do you think these practices helped shape Rome's history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective on these brutalities and how ancient societies faced justice. Rome, the great civilization, was responsible for some of the most brutal punishments humanity has known. These punishments, far from being mere acts of vengeance, were displays of the empire's absolute power, where human life was cheap and discipline was enforced with blood. However, in the darkness of these punishments, we can also see how fear and control governed the lives of millions under the Roman yoke. If this video surprised you and left you thinking about history beyond what the books teach us, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell to keep discovering more secrets of Rome and other civilizations. See you in the next video, where we will continue to unveil the darkest stories of humanity. Until next time.